Okay, so I'm going to be talking about the security features of TLS 1.3, which was just released last year, if you know about TLS. It's a little bit a story of using the right cryptography to make sure that things don't break down. So it's a little bit similar, but it happens at a higher level. So the outline is going to be, first I'm going to talk a little bit about TLS, put it in context, where it sits in your browser to server communication, why it's there, what it's trying to do, and how it's going to do it at a very high level. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about how we got to TLS 1.2, the sort of the very early start and kind of the problems with TLS 1.2. And then finally, I'll be outlining what's new in TLS 1.3 and why you should try to use it as much as possible. So TLS, where is it? Why is it there? How does it work? So in essence, TLS sits at the very top layer. So it's kind of the first thing that a web server would communicate over at the application layer. Yeah, so we have all these layers, that really help the data going through. And TLS is right here. So above the TCP protocol, between the application and the IP layer. And it uses components from like PKI, which you saw with Bart yesterday. And so its aim is to release the secure the communications from one application to the other. So see, this is why. Sorry, there we go. Okay, so here the data is always passed down to the next layer, and each layer is sort of oblivious to what's passing down through it. So the idea of TLS is that whatever the application is going to try and pass down into the network, it's going to take that, it's going to protect it, wrap it up with encryption, authentication, confidentiality, and things like this. And then so that you can be sure that once it's passed down to the IP protocol and even lower, all this data is completely private until it comes back out on the other side. So what are the goals? The main three ones are authentication. You need to make sure that the servers are always authenticating to the client, so you want your web browser to be sure that it's talking to the right websites. And you want the option for clients to be able to authenticate back to the server. So in a kind of in an enterprise kind of setting, employees might have authentication credentials on their laptop, and the company servers might want to be able to authenticate them over TLS. Of course, you want confidentiality. Your data must remain secret in transit. And you want integrity, which just means that your data must remain whole in transit. You want to make sure that someone who's on the network, even if they don't know what is passing through, they shouldn't be able to change. So the typical example, if you're making a bank transfer for $100, you don't want it to change to $10,000. So TLS, as I said, sits between the application and the IP layer. It sits over the TCP protocol, and it's got two main sort of sub-protocols inside it. It's actually TLS is a little package of interacting protocols. You've got the handshake protocol, which, as you notice, doesn't communicate with the application, really. When you start a TLS connection, this is the first protocol that happens. It takes care of cryptographic negotiation, authentication of the parties, and key establishment. And then you've got the record protocol, and this is where the actual symmetric data protection happens. So this is where the application data is taken, encapsulated, and passed through to the lower layers. And this is where the incoming data is pulled up, decapsulated, checked, and put up back to the application level. So I'm going to be focusing mostly on the handshake protocol in terms of actually describing how it works, because this is where most of the cryptographic security guarantees are achieved. But I will mention some sort of elements, particularly like cryptographic algorithms, which are used in the record layer. TLS functions using what we call a sweet negotiation mechanism for the algorithm that it uses. That means that there are standards that fix a bunch of suites which specify which cryptographic algorithms you should use for which part of the protocol. So for your key exchange, for your signature algorithm, for your symmetric encryption, from your hashes, all these things are specified by these suites, which encode algorithms and parameters. It makes it really easy because you only need maybe 2 bytes of data to decide which suite to use. So that really helps. It's simple and compact, and it's supposed to help with the management of risk. Because if you've got a fixed set of algorithms that are the protocol says should interact in a given way, you would expect the designers of the protocol to make sure that it all works correctly. That's not always the case. So we'll have to see about that. The problem, of course, is that it's less flexible. You can't pick and choose at every layer, and sometimes that's a bit of a problem, especially if you've got, for example, like devices with restricted power capacities. You might be forced to use too strong algorithms, these kind of things. And of course, it leaves it open to have a number of suites that is just impractical. TLS 1.2, for example, at the time I made those slides, had 314 different suites that you could choose from. And if you don't really know anything about cryptography, sort of you've never really put your hand in like the deep end of it, you don't really know which one to pick from. You might have heard like, oh, AES is good, MD5 is bad, but that's about it. So there's still too much choice. There's still a lot of choice left for wrong decision making. So for example, here we have one of these suites, and we can see that the first one just encodes the name of the protocol. This, the ECDHE, is for key establishment. It's elliptic curve Diffie-Hellman ephemeral key exchange. RSA is the signature algorithm, so that's your entity authentication. With is just a keyword. AES is your symmetric key primitive. GCM is the Galois counter mode. And SHA-256 is the hash function you have to use. So you see we have the public key cryptography at the beginning. This is used for key establishment and authentication. And we also have the symmetric key, which is used for the record layer protocol. This is a TLS 1.2 suite. It's actually one of the best ones. So if you're still using TLS 1.2, you can pick something that looks pretty much like this. And you're fairly safe. So now that we know kind of how TLS works and what it's trying to do, I'm going to take just a little bit of time to talk about how we got there. Are there any questions before we got to that? No? I'm not losing anyone? Good. So TLS started off as actually called SSL. And sometimes I still go online to shop and they're like, secured with SSL. And I'm like, if you're actually using SSL to secure my connection, I don't want to pay with you because that's gone since 2015, technically. So SSL was originally released by Netscape. 1.0 was so broken it never happened. We had 2. It was, it was just deprecated. So actually, I don't know if the links will still work in the PDF. They did in the PowerPoint. But these RFCs are the official documents from the Internet Engineering Task Force. There's a bunch of links to them in the presentation. So if you're interested in actually looking at the official documents, why these things were removed, these kind of things, you can follow these numbers, if not the links. So SSL 2.0 was deprecated in 2011. SSL 3.0, which was released quite soon after and is not interoperable with TLS, was finally deprecated in 2015. For example, it was subject to the Poodle attack in 2014. And the problem is that even though it's officially not meant to exist anymore, old servers sometimes still run it, and that is a big problem. So then eventually we moved on to TLS 1.0, which was defined in 1999. It's essentially just a kind of a revamped version of 3.0, but with enough changes that it's not interoperable anymore, so it needs a new standard. Of course, for backwards compatibility, it has a downgrade mechanism, so there has been many attacks where attackers can sit between you and force you and the server who use a TLS connection to actually downgrade to SSL, and then they can attack the SSL connection instead. And it used DSA and 3DES as default cryptography, which just don't. Then in 2006, so about 7 years later, we had TLS 1.1. It was TLS 1.0 with fixes, so they removed some padding oracles. They added explicit initialization vectors to prevent attacks on the chaining modes. It moved on to RSA for signatures, but still triple DES. And so in 2018, in October, Apple, Google, Microsoft, and Mozilla announced that their browsers will no longer support 1.0 and 1.1 by March 2020. So this is not an official depreciation by the IETF, but it's actually quite good to see that the big players in the browser industry recognize that these protocols still have problems, and they're no longer safe to use. So if you're not on TLS 1.2 yet, which is really behind the curve, you need to move on quickly. So TLS 1.2 was defined in 2008, so not that long after 1.1. It was mostly changing, it mostly changed all occurrences of the MD5 hash function into SHA-1, SHA-1 into SHA-256. So which is good. It added AES compatible Cipher suites, again good, but it still supported things like RC4. It added authenticated encryption, which I believe you heard about yesterday. So Galois mode with AES, which is good, but these are just additions. Everything that was sort of problematic before, all the suites that are weak, are still in TLS 1.2. So this leads to like many different options, and like I said before, 314 different possible Cipher suites, which means many ways to get it wrong. So this is how the internet kind of looks today. Well, that was in February this year. 95% of websites support TLS 1.2. That's good. 5% of them is still a lot, but it's not the major ones. Browsers are typically like if you always run the latest browsers, they're pretty confident. They shouldn't let you connect to a definitely not to an SSL server, but they shouldn't really let you connect to 1.0 either. But we also see that only 66% of them are securely configured. So if 95% have the capacity to be securely configured, but only 65% of them are, then this kind of suite thing doesn't really solve your problem, because even though you have the potential to be secure, it's not quite there yet. So this is a little bit of an overview of how a TLS eventually trickles down into being a web browser. So we start with all the crypto primitives that we here at COSIC, we research those, and then we combine them into all these Cipher suite details. So we have data structures, key derivation protocols, padding, compression, these kind of thing. So there's already a gap between the pure crypto analysis and how it's actually combined with each other. Then we move on to actual protocol framework, where different elements of the protocol have to talk to each other. We need alerts and errors. The server needs to tell the client that something went wrong. We need to be able maybe to renegotiate parameters, to resume sessions. We have to manage secret keys. All of this is then packed into a library because it actually needs to be implemented in software, and the library is then put into the web browser. So we've got a very big gap between the original security guaranteeing algorithms and the final product, and it can go wrong in many places. So I'm not going to describe all these things, but you see that, okay, typically we're fairly good at the beginning, right? Okay, maybe DES, RC4, MD5, you shouldn't really move on from them, but the rest of it is still pretty okay. But then you move on to like the next layer, and we've got padding problems, encryption mode problems, compression problems. Then like in the protocol side, we've got problems with like renegotiating, downgrade attacks, all these kind of things. And then the libraries and the browsers, there's always going to be problems everywhere. But the thing with the progress of TLS up to this point, as you saw before, is very much a break and fix cycle. There's a problem, we put out a patch. There's a problem, we put out a patch. And when about almost 5 years ago now, work on TLS 1.3 started, they were like, okay, let's kind of break this cycle, let's break the wheel, let's take it down from scratch, let's see what we want to do, and build it up again. So in August of last year, this is the official RFC, TLS 1.3 was finally finalized, and it has quite a lot of changes. So, for example, only authenticated encryption cipher suites and symmetric algorithms are possible. This is very good. Very secure symmetric key encryption. It changed the negotiation mechanism, so it's kind of separated the public key authentication key exchange from the record protection. You can kind of negotiate these two separately. And it's made negotiation a lot more efficient, a lot more straightforward. It has deprecated static RSA and Diffie-Hellman key exchange. And it has, so by deprecating static, it has forced ephemeral key exchange. So that ephemeral key exchange, that's for every new TLS session there is a fresh symmetric secret key between the two parties. That causes some problem in the industry because some businesses used the static functionality to have the same secret key for all their internal communication, and that way they could monitor traffic. But the IETF decided that privacy over the wider internet is the most important thing, that is their goal. And so now every single session is, in TLS 1.3, is protected with an ephemeral key. And this means that we have all forward secrecy for public key-based key exchange. So your typical first handshake with a server is public key-based. And that means that if the server one day loses its public key, it gets leaked, something like this, the session that you had with the server, as long as you deleted the key afterwards, remains secure. So even someone who was recording the traffic, they still cannot decrypt. There is also added encryption into the handshake. I'll describe the handshake protocol later, but this means that the server hello message, which is the message in which the server sends its certificate and says this is who I am and this is how I'm going to authenticate, is actually already encrypted with an ephemeral fresh key. So this means that someone who's listening in on your traffic cannot see who you're connecting to. So it's adding a little bit of privacy and anonymity. It's also redesigned the key derivation based on a primitive called HKDF. And this leads to better formal analysis. So I'm not going to go into models of securities and proofs and things like this. But this was actually a big part of TLS, of the process of creating TLS 1.3. The engineering community was very open to input from formal security researchers, academics, and actually all along the process there were many of the early drafts were sort of not implemented but analyzed in a formal way. Some formal proofs were given, some formal attacks were found by verification tools, and this really informed the design process. So not only was kind of the cryptography sort of rebuilt from the bottom up, there was also a lot of input, just like how the protocol would talk with itself, all these kind of things, and it was really great to see that much input from the formal analysis side. And also finally, this is what I was saying about efficiency. The handshake is now only one round trip time. So that means that after one message, client-server, server-client, the client can already start sending data. This was not the case before in TLS 1.2. So by default, we are already gaining one round trip of efficiency. And TLS 1.3 actually has a 0 round trip option, and we'll describe it a little bit later. Which means that if you've had a session in the past with that server, you can say, let's use some key material we had some before, and let's start sending some data immediately. As always, increased efficiency comes at the cost of some security. So there are some caveats with this zero round trip option. For example, forward secrecy doesn't hold perfectly, but it's an option to send sort of non-sensitive data already when you want to resume a session. So this is how the protocol kind of structure works, and we're going to talk in particular about the handshake protocol, which looks like this. So it looks a bit complicated, but it's not that much, and we're going to talk through it. Cryptographically speaking, it's what we call an authenticated key exchange protocol. So the goal is to obtain a shared random secret key, which is bound to the identities of the party in some way. So we start with Cipher pairs negotiation. We see that in the client hello message, in the first one, perhaps I'll just say, so the black messages are the compulsory ones. They must happen in every TLS session. Some of the other ones are, the plus ones are potential extensions that are part of this message. And the other dotted ones are potential messages, which I'll come to describe. So the Cipher suite negotiation starts off like this. The client suggests a list of suites that it is willing to use. And these 5 suites are actually the only 5 suites allowed by TLS 1.3. So already we go from almost 300 possible choices to just 5 for symmetric cryptography. All of them use, all but one of them use AES at least at the 128-bit key level. One of them actually has 256. You can use them either in GCM or in CCM, which is authenticated encryption with associated data. So immediately we have confidentiality and integrity here. Very strong hash functions. And this middle one here, the Chata 20 poly 1305, that's it's a Cipher suite whose algorithms have not been standardized by NIST, I believe. And so it's kind of, if you're a bit wary of US government interfering, you can always choose that one. But I mean, AES in GCM is perfectly fine as well. One of the key things of TLS 1.3 is it does not allow renegotiation. Once you've fixed your algorithm at the beginning, you cannot change it again. This was a problem in TLS 1.2, sorry. Attackers could let the session start, and then in the middle of the session use the renegotiation mechanism to downgrade, and therefore exploit weaknesses in weaker algorithms. This is not possible. I mean, not that any of these algorithms are weak, but renegotiation is just forbidden. So then we come to the ephemeral key exchange part. So the client has to, also in the client hello message, has to choose one of the supported groups for key exchange. And again, we only have 10 possible groups for, so here. So if you combine that with the 5 possible symmetric key suites, we only have 50 possible combinations. And all of these 50 are pretty much like good. There's varying between, here we have like 2048 bits of security all the way up to 8192. So if you want your data to be safe for a couple of centuries or for just a couple of years, you've got some range. But this is what you're limited to. And therefore it means that whatever you choose, you're going to choose a fairly decent combination. So TLS 1.3 doesn't really let you pick weak cryptography. Strong cryptography is built in by default. As I was saying, the ephemeral part is mandatory, so it provides forward secrecy, which means that if you manage your keys correctly and you erase them after the session is finished, your data is theoretically secure, even if authentication keys are leaked. So then the server responds with his own message. He chooses the suite out of the ones that the client offered. He also chooses the group. I forgot to mention that here the client can choose several groups, and for each of them he must include his part of the key exchange. So this is still only the first message. Then in the second message, the server picks the group, picks his key share, and we've already had a kind of Diffie-Hellman thing. Alice picked hers, Bob picked his. So the server already has an ephemeral secret key because he's already got the client's contribution and his contribution. So just after the server's response, we already have an established secret. Less, not so much cryptographically speaking, but like more in a protocol kind of way, the protocol has very strict conditions for what the server can accept and when the server will allow a downgrade. So there is a possible hello retry request message, if something's gone wrong. But essentially, if you read the draft, there are a lot of options, like if you follow the path, if something's not right, abort. If something's not right, abort. The server will not yield to an insecure connection. If something's a little fishy, it will just abort. And this prevents many nasty situations. And for downgrade, actually, there's also something quite clever. The server hello message is supposed to include a random nonce because you need a unique random identifier. And if a 1.3 server is asked to do a 1.2 connection, they will include a fixed arbitrary value within the last bytes of that nonce. So that if a TLS 1.3 client receives a 1.2 message with this particular arbitrary value, it knows that it's actually talking to a 1.3 server, but something in the middle is causing the connection to revert back to 1.2. So by hiding these little values in the messages and in other ones as well, there is kind of a mechanism for 1.3 enabled applications to recognize each other and abort and restart if something's going wrong. So then we move on to server authentication. So we've picked our symmetric key cipher suites, we've done our key exchange. And because we've already done our key exchange, we already have this encryption, which is with this little squiggly bracket notation. This certificate is already encrypted. So it's not authenticated in any way. We just have a fresh Diffie-Hellman key, but it's already protected from any eavesdroppers. Then there's this certificate verify message where the server has to sign the handshake and its certificate. So it provides both confirmation of the identity and of sort of the reality of the handshake that's happened. Because if the client has a different version of the handshake from as from the server, this message will not pass. So yeah, we have authentication and integrity. And they use HMAC to provide the finished message. And this provides what we call key confirmation, which is a more minor form of guarantee in authenticated key exchange. But this means that when the client receives this finished message, it knows that not only the server has interacted with the server, but the server actually has derived the key. So he knows that someone out there has the same key, and he's good to go for the symmetric part. So then you have potential client authentication, in which case you would have mutual authentication. The server can request it, and then the client has to provide similar messages. But the finished message is always compulsory to provide, again, integrity and key confirmation. So this is kind of the basic structure of a mutually authenticated handshake example. We've got the key, and the client actually picks the signature algorithms that it can accept. The server completes the key exchange. It can send some parameters if he wants, such as certificate request for client authentication. Then the server has to do its certificate authentication. And it could potentially start sending some application data here because it's already derived everything it needs. The client will then respond with his own authentication if he's been requested, and then application data can be exchanged. So this provides forward secrecy, as I said before. Something else that it provides is key compromise impersonation resistance, which is a bit of a mouthful. This happens when a client loses its authentication key. So if you're an employee of a company and they've given you a private key to be able to authenticate to your company when you're abroad or off premise, and you've lost that key, it's been leaked, an attacker who knows that key is not able to pretend to you that he is your company. So he's going to be able to go to your company and authenticate as you, which is a major security risk, of course, but he's not going to be able to go to you and pretend that he's your company. That losing your own key does not help someone else do that. And this is what KCI resistance means. So it's additional, and again, this is where you see kind of the influence of theoretical key exchange in the process, because this is a bit of a theoretical notion, but actually it's been shown that this simple protocol provides it. So here we have a 1 round trip time where you have to establish the key first and then application data can be exchanged. Still better than TLS 1.2, but there is a 0 round trip time mode where if you have a previous connection, during the connection, the server can say, okay, let's derive some material from our secret key and let's store it for later use. So when the client comes back, it says, hey, by the way, last time we talked, we have these keys that you asked me to derive, and I have a bunch of them. So what do you want me to do? And the server says, well, okay, actually, let's use them, and then let's finish our little conversation. So here already the client says, I've got all these keys, I can send you some application data already. And the server can just pick one and continue. One thing that is possible, and this is where the key exchange mode and the key share elements come into play, is they can refresh with more. So they can use a past secret and then add more randomness on top, just for more security. Now the problem is this does not provide full forward secrecy. These things can be broken in some ways, and the server cannot guarantee uniqueness without actually keeping a log of all these messages. So that means there's replay attack potential. This message can be replayed by anyone, and so there is a warning that if you want to use this mode, you have to be very careful as to which kind of data you use in this first message. Once you've refreshed your key, the connection is secure again. But in the first one that the client sends, there is weaker security guarantees. So you have to be conscious of that. So to summarize, TLS 1.3 will provide data confidentiality with forward secrecy, identity privacy, since the server and the client certificate will be encrypted, entity authentication, downgrade protection, data integrity, and 1 round trip time latency. So improved, so very strong formal kind of security guarantees and efficiency as well. So even though it was 4 years in the making, it was kind of worth it to kind of rebuild it from the bottom up. So to compare with TLS 1.2, we've got mandatory strong crypto, mandatory strong combination of crypto, because that's also a problem. We have forward secrecy by default, and actually it's not even by, I mean, I was going to qualify this to say, because when you say something's by default, you think you can turn it off. You can't really turn it off here. Except the European Institute of Standards has produced a protocol that they would like to call enterprise transport security, which is their response to this problem in the business I was telling you about, that some people have a problem with this for like auditing purposes and things like this. So there is kind of a copycat protocol which restores static to static key exchange. It's not endorsed by the IETF at all, and so you have to be very careful as to which one you want to use. Here you have to have server authentication, you cannot do without. We have improved efficiency, we cannot downgrade, and we cannot renegotiate. So really trying to keep the connection as secure and as stable, and if something goes wrong, you just cut it. You don't retry, you don't try to pick it up. So after 6 months roughly, we were still only about here. So it's not great, but it's still there. I haven't actually checked recently. Maybe we've gained a couple of %, but I don't think we're quite there yet. But it's good to see some progress, at least. So if you ever have the choice, do choose TLS 1.3. If you're interested in implementations, there is a list on GitHub. And yeah, I'm happy to answer any questions if you have any.